Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hope you're doing well. So we're continuing our reading of this radical feminist book. It's very important for us to see where their goals are, what do they believe in, and then be able to compare and contrast that to Islamic values. Because a lot of the red pill Muslims label everything as feminist. A woman rides a horse, feminist. She wants to take some night classes on coding or graphic design, want to be educated, feminist. I mean, everything is feminism now. So the word is getting diluted, just like the word Nazi and racist and bigot and phobe. Like if you put phobe at the end of a word, it means like, oh, the irrational fear of something. And so we don't want that to happen. What we want is to have the principle of charity to accurately identify what it is a person is saying and then argue against the actual principle, not strawmanning them. And so by reading their texts, understanding them clearly, hearing them out and showing them due respect, we then can argue against them more effectively, I argue. Alright, so she went on more to talk about the R word. She kind of blames gendered violence on white supremacy, and I'm not surprised by that. But it was a lot of stats and stuff that we kind of already know, right? So I went down another part here. The message is clear. The pain in women, of girls, does not matter. It is right and natural that public conversation about our word and the law is still largely about protecting men from lying women. Protecting men from lying women rather than protecting everyone from violent men. It is right and natural that women bury the pain of the past so that men might enjoy that promise of a brighter future. So she really essentially feels that society doesn't do enough to protect women from male aggression. The connection between sexual oppression and social repression has been explored by philosophers for centuries. Oscar Wilde reportedly wrote that everything is about sex except sex. Sex is about power. Conversation being had right now is about the place where sex and power meet. It's not enough to just reframe the rules. To ask how precisely flirting and effing should work. Now that women are asking to be treated at every stage like people rather than status objects. Okay, hold on here. So she uses a very vulgar word. Effing. It's like she really detaches. That's really a way that a hedonist who doesn't value the spiritual connection or the reproductive values talks about it. When you want to insult someone, when you really want to be quite nasty, you can bring up that word. And when she's bringing that up to us, we shouldn't mistake what it is she's trying to do here. Now, she's contending here that women are asking to be treated like people. I think in some cultures, there's definitely a problem. There's definitely a problem of people who they actually think, women are less than. Because the more I'm exposed to different ideas across the world, the more I kind of realize, like, oh, maybe America is, like, the West is in a bubble in how we view women. But we view women to a point where we don't want them to have any guardrails, so they kind of go off the rails. Whereas I'd argue in some cultures, they infantilize the woman and treat her like a drunk retard. And they handicap her. And I just think it's quite different. Rather than status objects. So remember, the trophy wife, I've been listening to some gold diggers talk about trophy wives. And I think it's quite fascinating, some of those. Now, these women are, I'd say, kind of witches. But they had an accurate representation how high status males don't go after the women who cook and clean, look more homebody, they're more plain and spiritual. They consistently go after the very Jezebel gold diggers who dress immodestly, because the men judge each other by their wives, and men often value looks over character. Now, what's fascinating in Islam, the woman isn't in a niqab, so they can't really compete in the same sense. But as more and more women are unveiled and free mixing, the men are competing with the beauty because of the face, right? They're competing with the beauty. So men will compete in that sense of whose wife is hotter, right? And if you're a successful male but have an ugly bride, then you're in trouble. The only group that doesn't do that is the American Jews, like Chuck Schumer. You look at his wife, I almost thought it was a man. Some people have pointed out that, like, the rich Jays, they go for bloodline, they go for assets, for money, over looks. To them, looks is not as important as the status that you bring, the connections you bring, the network around you, the deal that will be made. It's more political, it's more survivalist in a sense. It's fascinating. So there's much that could be said. Because I also saw a video of, I think it was in Malaysia, two Muslims getting married. The bride was very obese, and the guy was in shape and handsome enough. But he's marrying this big chick. And it was like, why? Probably the dad, you never know, had some type of status, so he, was with her. If she gets pregnant, she'd have some serious problems, because for breathing, I'd argue. She has to lose that. But there's that example of Roose Bolton in Game of Thrones, where he marries Walder Frey's, one of his fat daughters, because he promised her his weight in silver as a gift for marrying her. So the fatter the bride, the more silver he got. And like, there's an example of that in history and even in fiction, right? Of, don't just go for looks. Go so you can have a status object of a wife. You can measure success in multiple ways, right? So it's interesting she mentions the status object, because the gold diggers argue that, you can judge a man's success by his wife. Also, if you look at these red pill Muslims, they go to the loose women, cycle through them, do these 2-year marriage contracts, dump them, and then they seek out like a virgin who they can, get, and the dad has no idea how much of a sleazeball he is. He's good at charisma, lying, and sneaking, so he can get one over on the wali. And he just has a trail of broken hearts that he did, and he didn't catch an STD. It's quite sad. So the status object of the final wife is very telling. If someone has secret wives, which the red pill Muslims seem to be promoting, she's not a status object. The first wife is like the trophy wife. The other 3 are just used for sex and neglected, right? They're not taken care of as in any type of noble sense. Usually those women work, they don't have someone to warm their bed at night, and they meet him, they're in a hotel once a week, once every 2 weeks, and their marriage is a sham. So they're not status objects. They're just something to be used. And they have a fake nikah, thinking that they're some type of special wife, when in reality, they're anything but. So she mentions here, or receptacles for men's pleasure and pain. So receptacles, I think that is actually a very accurate word. because the more you talk to these women in the adult entertainment and you learn from them, these men really do view a lot of those women like that. And even when they get a good wife, it's not good enough for them. They still want more. They're never satisfied. It's just endless holes. They look at it. And it's quite sad. It is quite sad when women are treated in such a horrible way. I really hope, well, I don't have to really hope, but we know paradise, for the women who get in, they'll be completely happy. But even in paradise, men will be rewarded with the houris, the new creation. So men's entire existence revolves around vaginas and humping. And it's such a paradox to then think about what is the value of woman. What is the value of women and what's the value of a woman? And being a woman is such a troubling thing when you look at it. It's such a conflicting thing being a mother, and then knowing the male gaze of different men sees you just as that. And you were born like that. It's just so different. And then those same men will complain that they're looked at as banks. Oh, you shouldn't want me just for my money. You should be with me even if I become a cripple or this or that. But if the woman gains weight or she gets cancer, loses her beauty, a lot of the men will dump her and they go and chase, a younger woman. She's left alone to die or to be taken care of by her family. So it's fascinating. You have to be very careful who you get with. It's not bad to be seen as a status object, but it is bad just to be seen as a reciprocal for the man's entertainment. It is why some of them work so hard. They want to have something nice to come home to. So us as women, we cannot understand the male mind's way in which he views us. But pleasure can also be mental peace. Can be a lot, can it? Also the pain, men who come home in rage and get attitude, snap too much at their wives. They're soft on their bosses and soft on their co-workers, but they're quite mean to their wives and family when they come home. To change the culture of consent, we need to move on from talking about rules and start talking instead about ethics. I mean, rules and ethics, huh? Talked about the ethics of the rules. About what sort of society we want to live in and what it will take to get there. Consent culture, first named by activist and sex-critical feminist Kitty Stryker. Okay, I've never heard of this chick. Let's put these little consent culture and intimacy critical feminist. Is the alternative to all this. Resisting a culture of R-word and abuse must involve more than insisting on the individual right to say no. Although that's both a decent starting place and a difficult concept for some people to wrap their forebrains around, there's a reason for that. The reason that the notion of real, continuous, enthusiastic sexual consent is so outrageous is that the concept of female sexual agency, let alone active desire, is still a fearful one. I think I can see her point. When that cult member, the transformed wife, was saying it's okay for a man to just approach his wife while she's sleeping after she said no and just shove it in, which can tear her tissue because she's not actively lubricated. And the red pill Muslim men were saying a wife has no right to say no, and that basically she's just an object. She's just a humping post. So if she's pushing him off, she doesn't want it, she said no, and he can just force himself on her, because to them, they'll just say the word doesn't exist, even though the action is still a violation of bodily sovereignty. And then they'll use the hadith about the angels will curse the woman if the man goes to sleep angry at her. But the whole hadith proves he went to sleep without R-wording her. Doesn't say if the angels curse you, then your man can force himself on you. And if you get stitches down there, or you're tender, or you feel horrible after, and you start to resent your husband because he approaches you like a bear, then you are going to start to hate him and hope he dies, right? And then get a divorce as soon as you can. And women who get approached in such a violent manner by their husbands, who watch too much BDSM porn, they actually start to romanticize and want a chivalrous, charismatic, classy gentleman. So those men think, oh, I'm living out some type of BDSM fantasy by oppressing my wife and treating her horrible. I'm some Khal Drogo. But then the wife's like, wouldn't it be nice just to have a guy who, doesn't hurt me or whatever, and respects my boundaries, respects my desires, and has honor and manners. But again, it's quite sad. So I do agree that they don't care about enthusiastic consent. They don't, because I think there's a fantastic line in Game of Thrones where Dario Naharis says that there's something he never pays women to do anything with him. He wants her to want it, right? And there's nothing more thrilling than doing something with a woman who actually wants it. That's the difference between men who are word women, because they get excited with the woman saying no, and then the men who, even the hedonist, if you think about it, if he is more of a like, I don't know, just think about how like that snake can kind of rotate. They have this different energy, and the woman will consent to it. It's quite different. He's Purvis gross, like how Andrew Tate's all oiled up and shiny, leaves his shirt open, wears too tiny shorts. They have this kind of pimpish, oiled up, pervy, leather couch vibe. And that's more of the fly going to the poo, I'd argue, right? They attract each other, but there's something very dangerous about men who get their masculinity from the misery and subjugation, degradation, and unhappiness of their wife, because they have a mindset that they've gotten from the online manosphere, from fake icons. So these men will use that Chad guy. They'll use like famous actors as their profile. Those men in real life are probably really ugly. They don't have triceps. They don't have biceps. They're not attractive at all, but the way they type, you would think they were. And then they create a false dynamic, and there's a lot of them are not married. They don't own property, don't own cars, don't have a farm, never went hunting. They are still living with their parents, they have a lot of roommates, so they're not established males, but they talk the most, and then they misguide these married men into thinking that they have to treat their wife in the most grotesque manner in order to assert dominance over her and have the upper hand in marriage. So the more I've looked into this and been exposed to this in the red pill Muslim sphere, East meets West, and then examining our own culture here, you're like, okay, I can see how liberals go too far with the consent culture. Like the clever things the red pill Muslims do to mock that is they'll say, do I have to ask consent if I touch your shoulder? If I do this, they minimize it, and they will never acknowledge how there's other ways to like make your woman excited. And so many of the red pill Muslims, man, they'll lie to their own followers and pretend that their wife never says no. And that's how you know they're just not being honest, because once those people get married, they actually care about the woman cares about him. I'd say 40% of the time, man, bare bones minimum, women don't want it, but they just do it for the satisfaction of their husband, and they fake it. I mean, there's been tons of like anonymous articles women will write because they obviously don't want to reveal their identity, but half of them are just like, they fake it, they just get it over with, it's boring, it sucks. And then they wait till the man goes to sleep and they go finish it with a toy. It's quite sad. But hopefully we can get some more therapy for those women and whatnot. Help rekindle the flame. We want them to have happy marriages. But they just do it and they get it over with. And they just don't... It's just not very satisfying at all. And so it's fascinating to see all the different dynamics. So the red pill Muslims, they'll mock it and say, like, you don't have to ask a woman, we're married, it was in the contract. Already there, you see the danger, right? You see the difference of culture. How they think that once you're married to a woman, she's like cattle. She's just nothing. Just nothing at all. Her feelings, her emotions, her desires, her satisfaction, her enthusiasm, her consent doesn't matter. So they trivialize it and mock it and then just say, our words don't exist in marriage. I'm going to give her a paper form every time. And they don't talk about the abuse that a lot of women suffer at the hands of men. Those women get access to the internet. They recognize, I don't want to be treated like this anymore. They're enduring it because they have small children. And then when they are able, they get a job. They divorce, they're gone. And then the men blame the feminists. But they never look inside and say, I treated my wife's intimacy bad for years. I disrespected her. I made her miserable. She hid it. She suffered. She hated me. She resented me. And I did this, and I'm sorry, and I made a mistake. No, it's, if they just don't have any access to social media, no feminists, I can just oppress my wife and she can just smile and take it all. And then those women develop a lot of problems later. Some of them become alcoholics behind their husband's back. They pop pills, they start using drugs in order to cope and pretend they like the intimacy with their husbands. It's very fascinating how people who are not around gentle animals don't understand the concept of gentleness. If you start beating a horse every time, treating it real cruel, it's going to start kicking you, it's not going to like you. Same with a dog, you know? Certain animals, if you start to treat them bad, they'll every time they see you, they start to connect that energy with you, and then how you behave is going to show up in that creature's actions and reactions to you. And so when it comes to the complex adult human female, how if she's pulling away, there's something that the man is doing. And you have to care enough to say, hey, and not just be lazy and entitled and expect it. You come together, you work on it. So when I read something here, to draw it all back, about enthusiastic consent, I see it, and I do realize that some men get disgusted when they think that a woman has active desire. They think only a whore has that, but it's just not true. And a lot of those men honestly could care less how the woman feels. As long as they get their 6-7 minutes in and they fall asleep within, so short after, they don't really care that if she's laying on her side, totally unsatisfied, staring up at the ceiling, wishing she could just get out. They don't, and then she keeps it inside. They go to bed. They wake up in the morning, and there's kind of like this weirdness. She's got to go do ghusl. It's really telling. I mean, so many books and so many stuff could be written, but it's very strange and sad. I really hope that there can be good guidance. Now let's continue on with her point. She's going to go off the rails a bit. Our culture still has very little room for the idea that women and queer people, given the chance, want and enjoy intimacy just as much as men do. Okay. She always got to put in the queer stuff. That's the trickery of her. She talks about women, and you're like, hey, I see what you're saying. And then she brings in queer. You don't need the third category. It's human male biology, human female biology. Okay? You don't need to create a third category. we must get to grips with the idea of consent as ongoing and negotiable, rather than consent as an object, a one-time contract that can be fudged or debated in court. That's a good point right there. Right there. That's very interesting. Ongoing, negotiable. Now, when she mentioned here a one-time contract, I'm thinking of the nikah. I'm thinking of how scary it is as mothers when you're seeking a suitor for your daughters, that there are red pill Muslim coaches who teach that marital R word is okay. And then they use the religion of Islam in a way it's not permissible to degrade your daughter to the lowest common denominator, to that of dirt and dust. They never talk about romance and keeping the mutual bond together. She has to do it anytime, anywhere. Regardless of her feelings, she's not important at all in the picture. It's all about the man's orgasm. That's the most important thing in the world. The woman doesn't matter at all. And this may sound reductive, but the more you hear these men talk, the more you're like, oh, I've never seen this kind of viewpoint before. I've never heard men take pride in their wife not liking the intimacy. Usually you'd want somebody like, okay, she's a human, she's a person. I don't want to bruise the petals on the flower. I don't want to make her depressed. I don't want to make her suicidal. We'll work on this. Right? You don't hear that. It's being a dictator, a tyrant, an oppressor in your marriage, that's their standard of masculinity. It's very different, because one thing you can say about Spain, Italy, and France, you think of their stereotypes of men, it's usually suave. It's smooth. It's very palatable, because they have a way of being charming, and the woman enjoying that charmingness. Whereas the militaristic, dictatorial cruelty that another culture takes, that's seen as masculine. It's fascinating. But that changes over time. In archaeology, in sociology, anthropology, you can see how different cultures across the world measure it. So, when I read hadith myself, I don't see what the red pill Muslims see. So you begin to notice different perspectives. I don't see R wording being allowed. There's just so much that could be said. We'll pause it there. But I think as mothers, you should be very careful, because maybe it is true then. A father agrees that the son-in-law should treat his daughter like that. Because there are plenty of fathers in the world who don't really love their daughters. There are plenty of fathers who abuse their daughters. They abandon their children. We can't automatically think that every man possesses fatherly instinct. So it's up to the moms as well to really encourage their daughters to be wise and not be R-worded. To always have an option for your daughter to run away to. Women who are stuck often have to endure terrible marriages and terrible intimacy. But if your daughter has a place to go, she might have more agency to be like, no, this is what I want in relation to what we do. This is what's going to happen. And then they can have a kind of ebb and flow. They kind of learn each other. They understand each other's personalities, right? It's not just, I'm the boss. And a lot of the men who pretend to be that way, I think if you got their wives alone, or their wife divorces them and then you talk to the woman, she'd spill the beans. And you would see it's all a show for social media following. Because they have to get money. They want you to buy their programs. They want you to by their crap, their philosophy. So if they tell you that they're actually kinder than to their wives than they show, if they actually do sometimes don't get what they want or don't get their way, they're not going to be able to sell that to their male fans, right? And so they're not going to be able to sell that to their male fans, so they have to have a certain agenda they push. So we'll pause it there, and if you enjoyed that, make sure you join the blog at www.subscribestar.com/MilahanArchive. Hope to see you there.